Good afternoon. Thank you for joining our California Hydrogen Policy Series and happy National Hydrogen and Fuel Cell Day. My name is Ben Zong and I'm the Online Communications Manager with the California Fuel Cell Partnership. With me today, I have Andrew Martinez, Hydrogen Program Expert with the California Air Resources Board, David Park, Industry Affairs with the Fuel Cell Partnership, and Bill Elrick, Executive Director with the California Fuel Cell Partnership. Today's webinar is going to primarily cover the findings and data from the ARB's 2021 Annual Evaluation of Fuel Cell Electric Vehicle Deployment and Hydrogen Fuel Cell Station Network Development Report. A couple of housekeeping items before we get started. Today's webinar will be recorded. Once the recording and the presentations are posted, we will send out an email to all attendees with a link to where the recording and presentation slides are located. During the webinar, everyone will be muted. However, we will have a Q&A session that will be led by Bill Elrick at the end of the presentation. And so please use the GoToWebinar questions feature to ask questions to the panelists. Also, during the webinar, the panelists may have their cameras turned on. Please use the camera settings to either enable or disable, and you can also use the slider to change the size of the video feed. At the California Fuel Cell Partnership, we are a collaboration of over 50 industry and government organizations. While we don't work directly on the stations or the fuel cell vehicles themselves, our main goal is really to bring organizations together to expand the market for hydrogen fuel cell electric vehicles and to help create a cleaner future. If your organization is interested in joining, please contact us and we can discuss how we can work together to move hydrogen fuel cell technology forward. And with that, I'm going to hand off to our first presenter, David Park.
Good afternoon, everybody, and happy Hydrogen Day to all of you. To kick off this meeting, we just wanted to acknowledge the events of the past year regarding the hydrogen supply chain and the retail fueling network. And I'm just going to dive right into it. We want to acknowledge that it has been a challenging year for hydrogen fuel cell vehicle drivers who are really trailblazers in this technology and economy. And I'm going to go over, what occurrences happened in the last year, and then what the industry is doing to work to make sure that we don't see such massive disruptions moving forward. But starting in January of this year, as everyone knows, we had the second COVID surge, and that impacted supply chains across the country. But then moving into February, there were severe winter storms, mostly in the eastern and south and southern U.S., all the way into Texas. And if you recall back then, national freight supply chains were significantly disrupted across almost every sector, and that included the national hydrogen supply chain and deliveries of hydrogen to California. Once those supply chains cleared up, we went into March, and we have a base load of hydrogen supply constraints that have impacted the ability for our stations to stay fully supplied with hydrogen, where we have our vehicle fleet at a record level of demand, and we had consistent hydrogen supply, and we got to a balancing point where hydrogen supply and demand were almost neck to neck. So that there were challenges just in keeping adequate inventory of hydrogen at our retail stations. And then going into June and August, we had record heat across the country, also in California, and that did impact the performance of some of the retail fueling stations, resulting in increased fill times and sometimes short fills, meaning a fuel cell vehicle was not able to get enough hydrogen, or was not able to get a full tank of hydrogen with the fill. And then what happened in August of this year, we had in Northern California a distribution facility outage that impacted our statewide hydrogen supply and deliveries to our retail stations. And then in August and September, we had Hurricane Ida impacting the national hydrogen supply chain once again. So that brings us to October, this month now, and we are moving into where we were in March of 2021. If you look at the network, there are more stations with available hydrogen, and we still are seeing supply constraints where production and distribution of hydrogen are trying to keep up with retail demand, but we have signs that the supply chain will be improving, but we do predict that there will be that retail supply will be short of demand until the end of the year and moving into the beginning of 2022. What I'd like to discuss next on the next slide is how the industry is meeting the current challenges and how we feel that we've been through the valley and we are seeing signs that we're not going to slip into this level of disruption again. So Ben, next slide, please. So apologies for the fine print, but there's a lot of activity going on, and I think this slide will demonstrates that. But we're just to say up front, both the supply side issues and the retail station challenges are being addressed. We have, through station support, uptime and performance, which will continue to improve. And some of those improvements on the wholesale side, there are 3 big announcements on the production side, where we have in 2 facilities in LaPorte, Texas, a Linde facility, which is a 30 or more ton per day liquid hydrogen production facility that began operation in July 2021. And then we have an air products production facility also in LaPorte, Texas, which was announced yesterday that it had begun operation. We also have a Air Liquide Nevada hydrogen production plant that's a 100 ton per day facility that will be coming online in early 2022. So that's on the wholesale supply side. And then what we have also is another announcement by Air Products that they are developing a hydrogen production complex in Canada. That's expected to come online in 2024. And then domestically here in California, we're seeing investments on the retail side. We're seeing investments in bulk hydrogen storage and distribution in Northern California, and investments in delivery trucks. And just as a note, on the delivery side, what has happened in the past, and hopefully this is in the past, but loss of one driver could disrupt the supply chain. A loss of one driver or one truck, and that's exactly what happened in January of this year with that last COVID surge. The improvements that we're seeing on the retail side is there's been a surge in the hiring of staff at the retail developer operator level. So we're having station technicians and support staff better able to assist in repairing stations as they go down and for assisting drivers with their fills. We have investment, both public and private, into 127 new retail hydrogen fueling stations, and this will be above and beyond the current 47 stations that are currently online. We did see this year 4 new stations open since April, and although that may seem like a slow development time, we're seeing that the time from permitting to opening a new station, that timeline is shortening, and we're seeing general faster development time across the industry, and we have forces like the Governor's Office of Economic Development helping to accelerate, for instance, the time to permit a station, and we have their hydrogen station permitting guidebook as an example. these new stations are higher capacity multiple fueling position stations, so they will have more hydrogen stored on site, and they will have multiple fueling positions so that the time between deliveries and the number of cars that can fuel simultaneously, the time between deliveries goes up so that they don't need as many deliveries, and the number of cars that are able to fuel simultaneously also goes up. And then we're seeing station performance and durability upgrades, and the countermeasures that are being undertaken by the retail fueling owner operators in terms of their ability to make repairs without having to go back to the parts manufacturer and do in-house repairs. That timeline is getting shorter, and we're seeing also improvements in equipment and equipment reliability, including hardware, software, and new nozzle technologies. So these are a summary of the improvements that we are seeing happen real time and moving into the future, and hopefully we'll signal that this ecosystem is overall improving. Next slide, please. And just to wrap it up, because we are seeing that the supply chain will continue to see we'll see disruptions in the supply chain in terms of the availability of hydrogen in inventory, and then the availability of stations online due to, for instance, mechanical failures. We are urging drivers to check SOS, which is our station operating status system, m.cafcp.org. Please check that frequently and before you go to fuel. And we have some of our station operator developers have put stickers on their dispensers with this QR code. You can scan it with your mobile phone, and it will take you right to to our page. And for the iOS and Android users, you can save this to your home page for instant access. And with that, I'm going to hand it back to Ben.
Thank you, David. Next, we have Andrew Martinez, again, with our hydrogen program expert with the California Resources Board.
Thank you, Ben. Let me get set up to share my screen. And can you see the presentation right now?
Yes, we can.
All right, great. Let me close. Okay, there we go. All right. Well, good afternoon, everybody. Happy National Hydrogen Day. So I want to thank the partnership for inviting me to give this overview of our latest AB8 report that we just published sometime last month. I just want to begin with an overview of what AB8 is and what these reports accomplish, especially since we've been seeing a bit more questions from the general public to understand what exactly is going on, what this program is, and why these reports are issued each year. So just as a general overview, AB8, or Assembly Bill 8, was passed in 2013, and it continues through January 1st, 2024. The Assembly Bill 8 does a lot of things that have to do with transforming our transportation system, but one of those particular things is that it provides the California Energy Commission with up to $20 million per year for the development of at least 100 hydrogen fueling stations. And that is completed through the Clean Transportation Program. The Energy Commission carries this out through a fully public process. The Energy Commission every year has a process for developing the investment plan for the Clean Transportation Program, which includes feedback from an advisory committee, which includes feedback from a disadvantaged communities committee and our advisory group, and does consider feedback that comes in from the public, as well as stakeholders involved in transportation. So this is a very thorough process. And then from that investment plan, again, the Energy Commission always goes through a public process for developing and implementing specific grant funding opportunities or other types of funding opportunities for hydrogen and for electric vehicle charging and a whole array of other projects. So if you are interested in following that, definitely look to the Energy Commission's Clean Transportation Program to learn more. As far as the hydrogen funding goes, AB8 also requires semi-annual reporting based on the progress and an evaluation of needs for the hydrogen fueling development, So one of those reports every year is the report that we are going to be discussing today, which is the summer AB8 reports. These are released by the California Air Resources Board. The one that was released earlier this year or last month was the 8th such report. We've been doing this since 2014. We've evolved a bit in how we present our data and how we do our data analysis over time, but they're fairly consistent in terms of the overall goals and the overall messages that they are trying to develop. So by statute, every year by June 30th, CARB is to report to the Energy Commission through this vehicle, and we report out on the current and projected fuel cell electric vehicle fleet and station progress. So what's going on to date and what we see for the future. We do an assessment of network coverage and capacity, and we look at where are the gaps, where might we need to put more funding in for the next set of $20 million, et cetera. Again, where is that station placement supposed to go? How large should those stations be? And what technical requirements should those stations adhere to in order to best serve the fuel cell electric vehicle drivers? Those kind of form the pillars of what the core pillars of what this report looks at and what this report provides to the Energy Commission every year. We do also, of course, provide this report publicly a little bit later than it goes to the Energy Commission, just because of the time it takes to wrap up, clean up the report, and get it into the nice glossy version that we release publicly. In addition to the statutorily required aspects that we report on, we also do talk about different topics that vary from year to year. We usually do actually include a discussion of renewable hydrogen, but we have also touched on topics such as hydrogen production and supply, consumer responses to fuel cell vehicle adoption and the network, medium and heavy duty developments with respect to hydrogen and fuel cells, and several other topics. So for this reporting, oops, there's a slide missing. There we go. Somehow that slide got deleted. Apologies. So then, in addition to the summer reports, there is also a winter report that is a joint agency staff report from CARB and the Energy Commission. The Energy Commission is lead on this report, and you will see these reports published by the Energy Commission themselves. So the next one that will be coming out is December of this year, and that will be the 7th such report. And every winter, the agencies jointly again review the progress on developing coverage and capacity of the network sufficient for the fuel cell vehicles deployed and planned. But then the December reports tend to talk a bit more about the stations themselves and go into a little bit more detail about how these stations are operating and how these stations are being built. So it looks at time and cost to develop hydrogen fueling stations, and it looks at the remaining costs and time to establish that goal, that network of at least 100 publicly available fueling stations. Now, that was the original goal that you'll see many of the early reports look towards, but in the last couple of years, since Executive Order B4818 was passed, the report actually has started to look also at the 200 station goal. That 200 station goal was established by that executive order, and that's 200 stations by 2025. Again, these are kind of what is required of the reports by statute, but there are additional topics that the report will discuss each and every year. As I mentioned, there's a lot of information, good information about how the stations are performing and how the stations are being utilized. So we look at station utilization, station uptime. There are reports of estimated emissions reductions due to the hydrogen fuel sales that are taking place at these stations. Station economics, including evaluation of the prices that customers are paying at the pump, and global developments, and again, several other topics, just to make a list all at once. Now, when these reports are being developed, there are certain data resources that are actually specified by Assembly Bill 8 for some of it, but the two agencies also do look at supplementary information to provide the best overall picture of all the information that we know and that we have at our hands. So some of the things that are actually required by law are to look at current fuel cell vehicles on the road per Department of Motor Vehicles registration data, future projections for fuel cell vehicle deployments that are based on an annual survey that CARB administers every year, and looks at or asks auto manufacturers for future deployment plans for up to 6 years in the future. And then we include other things like public announcements of future fuel cell vehicle and hydrogen infrastructure development plans. The stations that do get funded by the state, they do have requirements for sending operational data to the state. So as we are able to report on that, we do. Status and projections of network development from conversations that we are constantly having with the station developers. Renewable hydrogen content as reported to the Energy Commission and CARB's low carbon fuel standard program that is sent to both of those programs by station operators, and there are processes for validating that data according to the requirements of both of those avenues. And then of any regular kinds of updates that we get from our public-private collaborative and cooperative efforts, like through the California Fuel Cell Partnership and other venues. I do want to quickly highlight or briefly highlight that there actually is a third report that is somewhat discussed in Assembly Bill 8. It's not directly discussed as a report, but we are going to be releasing a final very, very soon. We released the draft in November of 2020. And so AB8, in addition to providing the funds to build at least 100 stations, also asked the Energy Commission and CARB to develop those stations until the private sector is establishing hydrogen fueling stations without the need for government support. And to really evaluate that requires understanding of station and network-wide economics, and to be able to look at what is the potential funding gap. Does the gap still exist? How long might it exist? How big might that gap be in the future until we don't need to provide any more state funds? So CARB, with early CEC collaboration, developed a tool to do some scenario analysis and try to provide estimates of when self-sufficiency might be achieved and how much state funds might be necessary to get there. It's built on existing information you can find in literature review. We did a lot of interviews and surveys with industry members, and we did solicit outside expert review for the final version of the report. So we are looking forward to releasing it soon. On the left here is a simple figure from the report's executive summary that outlines some of the major factors that we found that that minimize the economic gap and how long it might get to self-sufficiency, and some of the major messages that the report covers. I'm not going to go into detail here because we've got plenty to cover about our annual evaluation. All right, so moving into this year's 2021 report, findings and conclusions. So every year, our first finding is always an update of what is the network status. So as of the time we finished this report, and actually I believe this is still true today, California's hydrogen fueling network has grown to 52 stations, with 48 of those being open retail stations available for customer fueling. There are 4 stations that we count as temporarily non-operational. They have been unavailable for an extended period of time, but through our discussions with the station operators, we understand that there is the intent to get them back to open retail status. It's just that the timeline is unknown. We do know that some of these stations are closer than others to getting back to open retail. But as of this moment, we're not ready to be able to project exactly when that would happen for any of these stations. So we aren't counting them as the full open retail set, but know that they are funded, they are out there, and hopefully soon they will be back in the network. We also do know that, of course, there are a number of stations that are new stations that are looking to complete their station commissioning process in the near future, and hopefully by the end of the year we will have a few more stations than the 52 or 48 open retail stations that we had in the summer. So kind of looking at this in a little bit more detail, on the left here is a bar chart that we provide every single year. We update it, and it gives you a breakdown of kind of the status of each of the stations. So you can see the 48 open retail stations, the 4 temporarily non-operational. At the time this report was written, there were 3 stations that were fully constructed. So they're just going through their station testing. Then they will soon do their commissioning and then be moved into open retail status. There were 11 stations that had been funded in earlier years, prior years, by the Energy Commission or through the LCFS hydrogen refueling infrastructure provision, and those were continuing their development, but they weren't yet completely done. Now, this year we talk a lot about the impact of what is called Grant Funding Opportunity 19602, and that was the most recent solicitation run by the Energy Commission for funding new hydrogen fueling stations. And that grant funding opportunity added over 100 new fueling stations to the plans for future network development. Of those stations, there are actually 66 of them that do not yet have a known location, and that's by design. The solicitation allowed applicants to propose the development of networks of stations over a period of approximately 5 years into the future. And they can do this in batches. And the only locations that were required at the time of application was for batch 1. So we don't have the locations for about 66 of those stations, but we do currently have 28 known locations now under development, and there are 16 future known locations. So those are locations in a second batch or later that some of the station developers, the applicants, volunteered to give the information for. So we're looking forward to those stations being developed, but that's going to be over the process of the next few years, of course. I'll discuss the timing of that, or the current projected timing on the next finding. On the right here is our evaluation of coverage. So this is coverage provided by the current 52 stations I talked about, really the 48 open retail stations. And so you can see that we've done a lot of buildup around the Bay Area, LA, and Orange County areas, particular, especially the southwest portion around San Jose, Mountain View, etc. That's where most of the coverage right now exists. In our analyses, we define coverage as being higher for neighborhoods or communities that have access to more hydrogen stations that are nearer to them. So the further a community is from hydrogen stations, or the fewer that they have within a certain driving time, the lower the coverage in that area. But you can see in general, there are stations, of course, in Sacramento area, there's one in San Diego, and we have a few of these connector and travel destination stations that improve the overall health of the network, improve the overall usability, but may not necessarily be used by a lot of people as they're close to home, their home base station. So our second finding is with respect to the projections for future network development. So at the time that we wrote this, after having consulted with the station developers extensively, understanding their schedules and their projected schedules for station development at the time that we were developing this report, we had projected that we would have 62 hydrogen stations by the end of the year. So that would be an additional 10 beyond the time that we wrote this report. We do still have to see if we will actually get to 62. Admittedly, typically our projections for that current year are higher than they end up being. But again, this is with the best available information that we do have at the time. As I mentioned, new station awards by the CEC have significantly advanced the outlook for future network development well beyond previous projections. So in this figure, there are two lines that are showing last year's evaluation for what we thought could be the future development of the network. And we were using a business as usual assumption at the time. If you look at the past history of station development in California, it's about a 9 to 10 station increase on average per year. We've had a lot of years that were lower, but we had a couple years that were higher as well. And so if you look at what our new projections are with all the stations that were funded now, we're looking at least 176 stations by 2026. Previously, we were only looking at about 120 by 2026 based on business as usual projections. Now, of course, getting to that 176 stations by 2026, that absolutely depends on being able to actually adhere to those station timelines that are projected right now. And so one of our related conclusions is that we need to find a way to ensure that future hydrogen fueling network development continues as close as possible to the pace of current projections. And part of that reasoning is to ensure that we can stay on track and stay on pace to meet the AB8 target, and to get closer and closer to the Executive Order B4818 target that we're working towards. So again, here's some more detail about those future station developments. As I mentioned, of the more than 176 station projects that we are currently tracking, 110 of them have an address. So there's 66 more that still have to have an address specified. I will also mention that this more than 176, these are stations that are things that are known to us right now through our funding programs. We are aware that there are some entities that have made public announcements of intent to potentially develop new additional stations beyond these, but we have not taken those into account yet because as far as we have seen, there are not concrete plans developed. We do not know how many stations are really being planned, and we do not know where they are. So in the future, if those announcements become more concrete, more crystallized, we will consider those stations and account for those in our analyses, but as of this moment, we can't. Looking to the figure on the right, this is a similar figure to the one I showed a couple slides ago for the coverage of the network, but this is for all the 110 station locations that we actually know of. And you can see that station coverage will continue to increase, especially in some of the areas that have been built up to date. So around Los Angeles, especially in Orange County, near Irvine and Costa Mesa, again, near San Jose, Cupertino, and similar cities in the Bay Area, Oakland and Berkeley area, San Francisco as well. But what you can also see is that the extent of the network, the coverage of the network is a bit bigger, a bit larger than it is today, right? Even in Sacramento, we're gonna get a couple more stations that will extend the coverage of the local network. San Diego will get a few stations that will also extend the coverage. And you can see that this Los Angeles cluster actually goes out along the coastline, almost all almost all the way to Santa Barbara, where you have at least a 15-minute coverage from every station, and that goes all the way into out into Riverside, and so you have this very long stretch of California, of Southern California, that will actually have pretty fairly convenient access to at least one station, with a lot of localized areas that have access to more than one station by the time just these 110 stations are developed, let alone the additional 66. So looking towards those goals of AB8 and the executive order, we do now, for the first time, actually anticipate that the planned network development will achieve the goal of AB8. So we'll get to 100 stations by 2023, the end of 2023, based on the current expected plans of the station developers. We'll actually have 104 stations. It's the first time that we have estimated that we could be meeting that target with not just stations funded, but stations actually open retail serving customers. And we also are narrowing the gap to Executive Order B4818. As the slide shows, we have 176 stations funded. We won't have that many open by 2025, according to our current schedules. And there is then still, after 176 stations, a gap to get to 200. However, there's good news there as well, because in the 2021 budget bill, which is Senate Bill 129, there have been funds provided for additional one-time funds provided for zero emission infrastructure, and through the Clean Transportation Program, the Energy Commission is proposing to put some of that money towards building hydrogen fueling stations and close the gap to 200 stations. In addition, we do anticipate that now we have had a lot of private funding. We now have, of the stations that we know that are planned, 23 of them are being funded completely by private industry. And so there is, of course, also the opportunity for private industry to step in and maybe add some additional stations as well. So that related conclusion, the budget outlined in SB 129 offers an opportunity for California to narrow the gap to the goal of 200 stations. So our next finding, finding 4, we were looking at what is the distribution of these stations and how are they potentially being distributed equitably, or at least to help serve disadvantaged communities as well as just the general public. So the planned hydrogen fueling network will provide convenient access to residents of disadvantaged communities. We find of the 110 station locations that we know, approximately a quarter of them, a little bit less than a quarter of them, maybe 20%, are actually located within a disadvantaged community. The time to get from a disadvantaged community to an addition to these stations then is less than a minute for an additional 29, less than 3 minutes for an additional 22 stations, and then within 6-minute drive for an additional 10. So the vast majority of stations are within a 6-minute drive of a disadvantaged community. And a 6-minute drive has previously been found to be kind of what's the average for today's gasoline station network to the residents of California in general. So we do find that much of our investment is going to putting stations within a convenient distance or convenient drive of disadvantaged communities. Now, when we look at the distribution of vehicles across the state, and this is based on our actual registration data, we do actually see some interesting things. We do actually see that the distribution of vehicles is quite a bit more spread out across the state than the network itself actually is. So we potentially have some drivers who are making special trips to get to stations that are pretty far away, definitely further than 6 minutes or even 15 minutes, or perhaps there is some private funding fueling opportunity that they have found that suits their needs. We actually find that there's fuel cell vehicles in almost half of the zip codes in California. And in addition, when we do a detailed analysis of the drive time from communities and populations within disadvantaged communities and for the general statewide population, we find that the access to hydrogen stations is pretty much equivalent between those two groups of people. So either whether you're a general Californian or you are a resident of a DAC, the access that you have to the network within a certain drive time is pretty much the same. You can see that through these statistics in the table on the upper right, how the numbers in the last two columns are pretty much equal between the two groups of population. So this is a good sign that there's potential for these station development to help the disadvantaged community members and their populations. We do caution that this is probably not a full evaluation of whether or not these stations are actually providing benefit. That requires a bit more analysis that we were not able to complete yet. And indeed, it requires some definitions and development of definitions and methodologies for analyzing that aren't quite in place yet today. But the state agencies are working on being able to better analyze this and have more informed data to be able to evaluate how well zero emission infrastructure is actually benefiting these communities. So our next finding relates to future station development. Where do we think that the stations should be going in the future? All those extra 66 stations at least that are planned through GFO 19602, where should they be placed? And so we do find that these station developments should focus on opportunities both in established markets, so your Los Angeles, San Francisco Bay Area, et cetera, and emerging new markets. Because of how well we are meeting the coverage needs, and in some places even some capacity needs, with the planned network, not just today's network, but the planned network of 110 stations, there now are opportunities in other markets outside of those first areas that have been the focus for the last several years that are at least as important as continuing to develop more coverage and capacity in those focus areas. So we are not saying that there's no more opportunity for development in Los Angeles or around the Bay Area, but what we are saying is that there is a lot of development that has taken place that is planned to meet that potentially higher demand, and now the opportunity in other areas is equally as significant. So a direct related conclusion is to encourage further hydrogen station network development in both the established and the new markets. This map that you're seeing on the slide is developed by our Geographic Information System tool. It's GIS tool that we have developed. It's called the California Hydrogen Infrastructure Tool that was first released in, I believe, 2015. We've updated in 2017, 2019, et cetera. And this is our tool that is publicly available. It does require ArcGIS and some particular license access through ArcGIS, but it is publicly available, and it is based primarily on public information, as well as some information that we have available from the Department of Motor Vehicles. And what it really does is it compares those coverage assessments that I provided on previous slides to an assessment of where the market for new fuel cell vehicle buyers, purchasers might be located. To dive a little bit deeper into this idea of these new markets, you could really see that there's a wide array of locations pretty much across the state, and this is really the first time we've seen this diverse of regionally diverse of a set of priority areas where we see a good deal of opportunity. So there's new opportunities in Central Valley. You can see Fresno, Bakersfield right on there. So especially that 99 corridor, Sacramento Valley, Palm Springs. There had at one point been a plan for a station in Palm Springs, and since that station is no longer expected to move forward, that Palm Springs itself is now a priority area. Additional stations along the Central Coast, really to bridge that gap between LA and the San Francisco Bay Area and hit some of those what may be considered destination areas, but also do have a sizable local population that can utilize those stations. And even all the way up in Northern California, we do see actually Eureka and Chico come out of this analysis as potential areas for new development of new stations. And at the end of the day, a lot of these areas are also areas that, from separate anecdotal information, we know that there is interest in having hydrogen fueling stations developed and fuel cell vehicles deployed. So we do think that there is a lot of opportunity out there that should not be overlooked when developing the future sets of hydrogen stations. Just as a side note, again, we did update the California Hydrogen Infrastructure Tool for 2021. We did not change any of the functionality of the tool. It was mostly a data update to the most recent available resources from internal and external sources. For those who may be on the line watching this who are applicants from GFO 19602, we are maintaining the 2017 version because, as you know, there is a piece of analysis and requirements for capacity that are based on the CHIT 2017 version. And so we are maintaining that version for that analysis and for providing that information going forward in the GFO. As I mentioned previously, one of the major statutory requirements of these summer reports is to provide information on the registered fuel cell vehicles in California per DMV data, and to provide projections per annual surveys of auto manufacturers. So this slide, this figure on the slide shows a summary of all of the information that we have gathered from those two resources since 2014. So the red triangles show the registration data. When we completed this report, our registration data as well is actually specified to be based on April data from the DMV. So as of April, there are almost 8,000 vehicles registered with an active registration. We do not count vehicles that are planned non-operational or have some other signifier in their data that they should not really be counted. Of course, the registration data now is a bit out of date. And in addition, we typically find that industry estimates for cumulative sales to date are higher. At the time we wrote this, I believe the cumulative sales estimate was around 10,000 vehicles total. We do know that there's a bit of a difference in timing of the data. There's a bit of a difference in definitions in the data. So they're not exactly one-for-one trade-outs for each other. So there will be naturally some difference. So just keep that in mind. If you hear higher numbers from other estimates, it's sales-based, it's a different time base as well. Now the shaded color, the shaded areas on this figure are from the two different portions of the surveys. So every year the survey asks auto manufacturers for fuel cell vehicle deployment projections for the remainder of the current model year and 3 model years into the future. CARB does some additional math to translate a model year into calendar year. So you're seeing this data all in calendar year. And that is mandatory. They have to respond in that 3-year mandatory period. Now, we also ask for optional data for a further 3 model years. And so there's always a variation in how much information, how much response we get back from auto manufacturers, especially in that optional period. And then what this chart is showing is it's showing for every calendar year, it's shown up on multiple different surveys. So for the year 2021 has been on the survey since 2015. And so it was a part of the optional period in years 2015 through 2017, but then in years 2018 through 2021, it was on the mandatory period. So the ranges you're seeing are for every year. That's the range that from all the surveys that addressed that year of deployment in the past. So we typically only focus on the end of mandatory period and end of optional period estimates. And this year we find that the projection is by 2024, approximately 31,000 vehicles on the road, and by 2027, a little more than 61,000. Now this is really good news because as you can see from the figure, in the past we've had some dips, we've had some flat lines, and especially in the past few years that has happened. This is the first time in a number of years that both the mandatory and optional periods have shown continued growth over the prior year's estimates. So you can see that the 2024 point and the 2027 point are higher than the year before. And the rate of growth, especially in the long term, is actually pretty high. It's higher than a lot of the previous data that we have received. Now, I do want to caveat and make sure everybody understands, because there's always a lot of discussion about forecasting. And forecasting, especially for fuel cell vehicle deployment, is a complex process, and it depends on a lot of factors that really do have high uncertainty. That includes the station network development, right? How well can we actually project we will stick to those current estimated timelines from the station developers? Not that the station developers get behind on their own, but there's always, and even in that process, unknown, uncertain, unplanned for things. Sometimes the permitting process takes longer than expected. Sometimes there are issues with the supply chain and getting equipment, especially as we saw through the COVID-19 pandemic. Model availability, how many vehicles, how many different models do the fuel cell manufacturers anticipate they'll be able to bring to the market? What is their confidence in consumer awareness and consumer desire for the vehicles? Vehicle and fuel prices that will potentially affect, especially fuel prices that will potentially affect the ability of the adopters to take on the vehicle technology and other factors. There's a whole bunch of different things that have to be taken into account. Now, at the end of the day, we do see so far that projections tend to be higher than actual sales, partially because you can't anticipate everything that will happen in the future. But what we do see is that when you look retrospectively at the past history of how station development timelines have shifted and how vehicle deployment timelines have shifted, we do see there is a clear correlation between the two. It's not a one-to-one, and it's not may or may not necessarily be a direct causation, but we definitely see that there is a correlation between the two. So as station development projections move further into the future, so do vehicle deployments. We also reported on this last year in our 2020 report with an analysis of on a similar basis, looking more at projections for meeting target numbers of stations rather than just overall. Having said that, and we are excited that we do have a lot of planned future vehicle deployment for the state. We do note that the current planned station network provides automakers quite a bit more opportunity to deploy vehicles than was reported on the last survey. In fact, the opportunity is as much as 4 times as high as what was provided on the survey. So what this figure is showing is it's showing the range of vehicle projections from a couple slides ago as these yellow boxes. That's just the ranges of those shaded areas from the other slide. And it's comparing it to the capacity of the funded network in terms of numbers of vehicles. And that's this gray shaded area. It is an area because there's a little bit of uncertainty in terms of how well will, or how much hydrogen will future vehicles actually require. Will vehicles get more efficient over time or not? Will they actually require more because they're going to get more powerful? We're not sure which way it will go. We don't know. So it's just a small range or variation around that. And what you can see, though, is that with the at least 176 stations that are funded, the network capacity is about 250,000 vehicles. And so that's about 4 times the 61,000 vehicle projection that we have for 2027. So there could be up to a 4 times vehicle deployment for fuel cell vehicles. So the related conclusion is, of course, there's substantial opportunity for further deployment beyond the current projections. Now, we do note and we do understand that the announcements of awards for these 176 stations were made not too long before we issued this year's survey. I believe the award announcements were made in December or finalized in December of 2020, and we had sent out our survey by February, and it had to be back by April. So there was only a little bit of lead time for auto manufacturers to consider that information. But probably more importantly, we do also again note that we reported out last year information from an extensive amount of interviews with the auto manufacturers, and really one of their biggest factors in making their vehicle projections as well is what is the on-the-ground pace of network development. So even though we have a lot of opportunity as represented by the funded network, they do take into account what is the on-the-ground pace, what have they seen in terms of how fast stations are developed, a bit more than these projections for future network development. However, this is a very big gap at this point, and so it is worth taking a look at and considering. I do also want to point out that this is actually the first time this has happened, and this is actually a good news story in terms of the funding, the success of the funding program. So this is the first time that we have seen that the projected station network development will actually outpace vehicle deployment. I didn't put every single report's figure on here, but these are the last 4. So these figures all have kind of a similar format to the one I just showed you. The difference is, so all of these have a shaded area that flatlines, right? And so that was the funded network in all of those years, that flat portion. In the first figure, it's a gray area. In the other 3, it's a green shaded area. And what you can see is that in every single one of these figures, that the yellow boxes were either exactly meeting the gray shaded area by the end, by their last data point, or more commonly, they were actually higher than the funded network capacity. So if you I'll just really quickly go back here where we can see the yellow boxes are all below the gray shaded area, and all these other figures, the yellow boxes are above either the green or the gray area. So this goes back all the way to our very first report. So it's a good story now that we are actually developing that opportunity more than we ever have for fuel cell vehicle deployment to increase in the future. I do also want to take a quick minute and discuss how these projections for the network and vehicles compare to that self-sufficiency question that I had mentioned. When that report comes out, you'll see that we did a lot of scenario analysis, and we looked at some pretty ambitious scenarios, things that get like 1 million vehicles and 1,000 stations by 2030, right? And we looked at, okay, well, how are we doing right now compared to those? So first of all, I'll start with the stations, which is actually on the right on this figure. So the gray shaded area, same one that I've shown before. The red shaded area is the capacity development from that scenario, from those scenarios that achieve self-sufficiency, build a network by 2030 that can of 1,000 stations that can support 1 million vehicles. And you can see that through 2026, essentially through all of the development that we have planned and known right now, our station network development will actually be ahead of that self-sufficient case. And so this is good news. We're actually pretty much right on track for what we know with what could be a self-sufficient development of the network in California. Now, there's that last data point that is a very big unknown, and to be honest, it's the data points between 2028 and 2030 that are even a bigger unknown. So beyond the question now on the station side is what's going to happen beyond what is funded. How fast can development, network development actually accelerate even further again than what we have seen as a result of GFO 19602. And so that is really where the question now remains. And of course, that is assuming that we can maintain this gray shaded path to those 176 stations. Another small detail you'll notice is that these number callouts, they're not incorrect. They're the numbers of stations that get you that capacity, either from our planned network or from that scenario analysis. And what you can immediately notice is that we're going to get the same capacity with about a little more than half the number of stations from that self-sufficiency scenario analysis. And what that's saying is that basically our stations that we're actually building are on average about twice as large in capacity as that scenario. And what we found, one of the major findings we came to through that analysis was that larger stations have a much better likelihood of getting to self-sufficiency earlier with fewer state dollars. So our network is actually looking pretty good in terms of the individual stations and being able to eventually get to that off-ramp from state funds. Now going back to the left with the vehicles, what you can see is that our projections through 2025 are actually ahead of the number of vehicles that are assumed in those self-sufficient scenarios. So the scenario that builds this network that can fuel 1 million vehicles by 2030, it has a very sharp uptick later on in the future years. But you can see our currently planned vehicles for most of this time period are ahead of it, or in good agreement. 2026 is where things start to change. So 2026, basically the self-sufficient scenario is a year ahead of our projections at 67,000 vehicles versus the 61,000 that we're projecting for 2027. But to be honest, the 2027 point is much higher. And then of course it gets even much more higher in 2028 and beyond. So again, it's a similar story to these stations. For right now, for the immediate future, it does look like we're on a good path to get to a self-sufficient development of vehicles and stations in California, but there's a lot unknown in those further out years, and that's a big load to lift, and that's where we need to be continuing to analyze and evaluate how the development is going. Now, we do get a lot of questions about renewable hydrogen, and of course, we want to get renewable, low carbon, low polluting hydrogen to be our source of fuel for this network. We do look at the requirements per Senate Bill 1505, which requires at least 1/3 of the hydrogen in California that is sold and dispensed through a state-funded station be renewably sourced. And the definition of renewable comes from California code, so it's defined in statute. Once the amount of hydrogen sold in California exceeds a certain amount, which is 3,500 tons in a year, then that requirement actually applies to every station, regardless of whether or not they have state funding. Right now, that's not really a question because we don't really have non-state funded stations. Well, actually, I take that back. We do now. Sorry, we do have 2 of them. So, but those stations actually are already under a separate requirement from our low carbon fuel standard program because they do generate credits in that program that require them to actually exceed the SB 1505 requirement and dispense hydrogen at 40%. Now, that 40% requirement was also adopted in the latest grant funding opportunity, 19602. Past grant funding opportunities from the Energy Commission required 33% most often, but there actually were some stations that were required to do 100%. And so we project that going forward, what we will get is for sure at least 40%, and so that's about 7% higher than the SB 1505 requirement. Now, we did in 2020 start reporting that we were hearing from station developers and operators that they were selling a lot more renewable hydrogen than that they were selling 100% within their networks. And so we looked at the LCFS data, we've looked at the data that is submitted to the Energy Commission, and so based on the LCFS program data, we do see that that percentage is actually, it's true, it's 90% or more in the past 2 years of the hydrogen dispensed in California is renewable. Now, we do know that that's not something that we can yet count on going forward. We have been told it's not built on binding contracts for the future, and so we can't yet project it going forward beyond today, but we note it as part of the operational history. So going forward, really what we need to do is we need to ensure that hydrogen supply, as you heard from Dave, especially earlier, especially renewable hydrogen though, does not become a bottleneck to successful hydrogen station network development operations. So we are definitely seeing, as we saw this past year, the sourcing of the hydrogen is a major question that still needs a lot of work, even beyond the station network development, the dispensing capacity. And to kind of highlight that, Dave mentioned some other facilities that I am not counting here, but we do know of at least 3 known planned private facilities, either in California or that have made announcements that they are directly to support California's transportation network, and that is the Air Liquide facility that Dave mentioned in Nevada, a 30 ton per day facility. There's a Plug Power 30 ton per day facility that has been announced for Fresno, and there's an SGH2 facility that's 11 tons per day that was announced, has been announced in Lancaster. So that's about 71 tons per day. From our prior analyses, the Energy Commission actually has initiated some funding of state funding of hydrogen production as well. They've funded 2 100% renewable facilities that are still in development that would bring an additional 4 tons per day. There is also right now a currently open solicitation underway for further funding of 100% renewable hydrogen production. So we have to see what that will add. But just to put it all together, that's 75 tons per day of fuel. And that's enough for sure for the 61,000 vehicles that we talked about as the current projection for 2027. But it's less than half of the funded network station capacity. So the funded network can fuel 250,000 vehicles. That 75 tons per day gets you a little bit less than half. It gets you about 45%. So as of right now, without further development of production resources or the dedication of existing resources to California's transportation hydrogen business, then we could have a situation where we'll get past this hydrogen supply bottleneck that we're facing right now, but then we might hit it again in 5 more years. So the state agencies will continue to monitor and evaluate the availability of hydrogen fuel, and especially renewable and low carbon hydrogen, to make sure that we don't have this continually be a bottleneck going forward. And with that, happy to take questions. I think I took a little extra time, but.
No, that was great, Andrew. Thank you very much. And we do have some questions, some good ones here. So let me see if I can queue some of these up for you. The first one here, and I'll put a few things together. You talked about the disadvantaged communities. And one of the questions is, can you define that for everyone? Hopefully that's
so
one.
Disadvantaged communities, as I was using, sorry. Did you?
That's it. Sorry.
Okay. Yeah, so disadvantaged communities, as I was using it, is actually the definition, and I am blanking right now on the statute, although we do name it in the report, but it is defined by statute, but the disadvantaged communities are identified by a collaborative effort through CARB and the and OEHA, the Office of Environmental Health Hazard Assessment. The kind of short version of it, to not get too technical, is that disadvantaged communities are communities that score high on an indicator for for multiple different issues that might negatively affect the health and well-being of people in those communities. And so there's two sets. One set of those is environmental factors, so things like gross polluters near the community or in the community, the amount of commercial traffic, etc. Known chemical issues, those kinds of things. So there's a set of factors that give you kind of an environmental score, and then there's a set of factors that are based on demographics. Things like income is part of it. English proficiency is another part of it. There are so many, I honestly can't remember all of them to name them off, but there are definitely experts at CARB and OEHA that have put a lot of time and effort into finding the data for this, putting it all together, and developing a tool which is actually available publicly. It's called Cal EnviroScreen. And so if you look up Cal EnviroScreen, all as one word, you'll be able to look at what the definitions of these disadvantaged communities are, where they're located, etc. For our work, what we do is we actually we take those definitions or those identified communities, and we look at the drive times, either from population points within those communities. So we look at the block level populations, the drive times from those points to the stations, or just from the overall area to the station as well.
And just related to that, what I might have inferred from what you said, looking at where I'll compare it to gasoline stations, I think you said about 75% of the hydrogen stations were within 5-6 minutes of these communities. I'm wondering more broadly, if we compare that to the existing gasoline network, would you say the average citizen of any sort is within so many minutes? Because I would assume we probably are. Kind of as a target, is it the average citizen is 6 minutes from a gasoline station, 15, 2? Do you know that?
So based on earlier work from University of California, Irvine, they identified that typical, I don't know if it's average, but typical drive time to a gasoline station would be 6 minutes. I don't think the evaluation was done separately for disadvantaged communities, because I think, to be honest, at the time the UCI work was completed, I don't think disadvantaged communities had been defined or were as well understood and known. So, and I personally have not looked at that question with respect to gasoline stations myself yet. But yes, the observation has been that a 6 minute drive time is what a typical person might have to get to their nearest gasoline station.
Okay, good. I thought that was the case. I wanted to put some perspective there. We had a question here, if I can find it, looking at the predictions for stations. And one of the questions was, it seems to be always higher than when we look back. Now that you know that's the trend, why not correct that? Or how does that keep happening?
Yeah, so yes, we know that happens, but so much of this is from literal unknowns and things that you cannot plan for. We do not really, at the end of the day, have enough information to fairly extend those timelines for all these station developers. So we do rely on just understanding what the latest information is. And to be honest, at the end of the day, we do update this information as well twice a year, in December and in June. So we do know, of course, between those times, things will change. 6 months in hydrogen world is a long time. Things change and move very fast in hydrogen. And unfortunately, when it comes to station developments, you don't often get stations that come online earlier than you expected. You typically get delays. You don't often get accelerated schedules. I will say that there has been one time that we did add a delay, and that was in 2020. We were in the middle of COVID lockdown, and station operators let us know, space station developers did let us know that they were having difficulty getting equipment for their new stations that they were building. And that was partially because just everything, like just shipping in general, was slowing down. Also, sometimes it was things like the engineers to build some of the equipment would live in one country, especially in Europe, and couldn't cross the border to get to the factory or the facility to develop the equipment in another country, right? So those kinds of things, again, those are things that you can't really quantify, you can't really anticipate. But last year we did add a 6-month delay for every single station that was currently in development, based on discussions with the station operators and confirming with them that that was kind of a reasonable estimate. At this point, we don't have a consistent delay that seems to be happening across every single station. Every station is its own story, and that is also what kind of contributes to making it difficult to just push all these stations out a bit longer, because we don't really know how long to push each one.
Good, thank you. So I'm going to try to actually put a few questions in one. In talking about really the progress, and I'm going to point out what you highlighted in the last GFO, and it really pushed things, advanced things forward rather rapidly. The self-sufficiency and what that's highlighting as an opportunity to really get towards the real end goal here of a complete transformation of the market and 100% ZEVs. There's a few questions in here around, well, we have the 100 and the 200 station targets. We also, and there's recognition that the 200 was an executive order, that we also have an executive order and regulations around 100% ZEV. So I'll frame a few of these into knowing there's lag times and these big objectives. How are you looking now? Has CARB through this program or maybe the state more generally looking at driving hydrogen development and fuel cell deployment to meet that bigger ZEV transition?
Yeah, so I think looking at the 100% ZEV transition, if you want to see a lot of the recent or what upcoming kind of state thinking about that, I should definitely take a look at the mobile source strategy that comes out of the California Air Resources Board. It does a lot of scenario evaluation. The latest version had some projections for different types of scenarios, like how do we actually get to 100% ZEV? Do we get close to it? What would happen with different advances in technology, different paces of different technologies advancing, etc. But even more recent, to just stay involved and keep an eye on the analyses that are going on for the Advanced Clean Cars 2, because Advanced Clean Cars 2, that is the actual regulation that will put in place or that will establish the requirements on auto manufacturers, with the goal of getting to or meeting the executive order 100% ZEV sales by 2035 for light duty vehicles. So there's a lot of work that's going on there. I don't know that I have off the top of my head what the exact scenario numbers are, but it's all public. This is again another public process, of course, for regulation development. And in fact, there is a workshop next Wednesday, the 13th, to give an update on the latest changes to that regulatory development process. Thinking for the infrastructure, that will probably be a part of ongoing discussions really with the legislature. At this point, all we have right now is AB8, which sunsets, well, or is effective through January 1st, 2024, and the low carbon fuel standards hydrogen refueling infrastructure provision. What that provision does, I kind of glossed over it, I didn't really go into it, but allows station operators to generate credits in the LCFS program, not just based on the sale of hydrogen fuel, but on the capacity of their stations. So it helps them have an income stream while the number of vehicles are low and the fuel sales might be low at individual stations. I will note that since we have had a lot of downtime right now, that credit generation is scaled to the uptime of the station. So stations aren't just getting credits just for sitting there closed. They do have to be able to fuel to get that credit. But yeah, that's the ongoing question. We did see some funding, one-time funding coming through the Budget Act of 2021, but to be honest, it's an open question of what will happen beyond AB8. Will there be AB8 reauthorization? Will there be some other form of funding? At this point, I cannot say what the state will do after AB8 is done.
Yeah, I'm really looking forward to when you publish the final self-sufficiency report. I think if I look at today, we have 3.2 billion in ZEV infrastructure kind of on the table this year. And your 300 million number, if I do my calculations right, that's less than 10% of this year's ZEV budget could push the light duty hydrogen market dramatically forward to reach that target. So it'd be a great conversation, and I'm looking forward to having you back on when we have that report to talk about it more.
Yeah.
Well, here's an interesting one that maybe you have some observations with, and it's the question is, why is it taking so long for identifying a planned station to go through permitting, construction, operation, the experience you're seeing there?
Yeah, it depends. Everything, like I said, so far, every station has been its own story. It depends on the local permitting process, just either the permit officials and what they want to see in the permitting, sometimes negotiations with the stations, sometimes, I mean, to be honest, sometimes you do have local, like the community pushes back, and there is a process that the local officials will go through public hearings, and that takes time. So that addresses I guess the permit part. Sometimes there's especially through COVID, there's been equipment delays. I have heard sometimes that there is a shortage of labor to be able to build the stations. There has been at times, there's been delays due to the station is built, but they can't get the utility to come out and connect their electricity. That has been actually affecting all ZEV infrastructure. That's been a major, maybe even to a bigger degree, a major barrier for charging infrastructure development. But we do see it here in hydrogen as well. I will say that kind of like the process of getting started, getting funded and getting your permits to the station or to the permitting agency has gotten faster and faster. We also see that the final steps, commissioning, are really quick. It's all that part in between, getting the permits approved and then building the station. And then one other thing that I will add is some stations, at the end of the day, these stations are not their own business or on their own land. They're all renting land from an existing gas station for the most part. There's like a few exceptions, but for the most part. And you honestly do have station owners, the gas station owners, who for some reason at some point along the development process back out, and they decide not to continue and allow the station to allow the station to plan on leasing that land as they had agreed upon. So we've seen that happen, and then to be honest, it's a pretty long process usually to identify a backup station. I will say that the Energy Commission, especially in this last solicitation, is trying to address that. They did require that applicants have a list of backup station locations available at the time that they are asking for each successive batch to be approved. So they have to at least have some stations in mind to go back to. But yeah, it's not an easy business.
And I would just highlight, we've recognized especially both the diversity, as you point out, but the permitting side alone, and trying to identify ways to, working with you, with GoBiz and others, trying to identify ways to help speed that along. I think I know the answer to this, but I will ask, and it is the Project Neptune by Shell included in your presentation? I believe that's referencing the, oh, I can't remember,
Yeah.
it was 40-some, 50 stations, but I think those are the same, right?
Yeah, those are, to my knowledge, the Neptune stations are included in the funded stations from, they are receiving funding from the GFO 19602 for those stations.
That was my thought as well. A question here, and this is an intriguing one to ask though. Has ARB presented this data to CEC, and then can it be submitted to the Clean Transportation Program?
The CEC definitely has this information. The CEC receives this report far earlier than it is eventually released to the public. So yes, the CEC definitely has this. I mean, to be honest, the CEC is definitely our collaborative partner, so they are for sure aware of all this information. They've received this.
Yeah, I think I'll put a personal, because I get to with the microphone here. I'd love to see more of your report reflected in some of the investment plan work. I know that was some of our feedback to them, knowing that there's a lot of work here. That and the mid-year study really are incredibly helpful. And so, you know, really recognizing it and seeing it would be great. Let's see, we have a lot here. So I promise everyone I will not get through them all. But I will try to pick some out here that I can quickly here. Can you expound further on your point about future station capacity 4 times more than projected vehicles? Is this perfect math? Hence an assumption of every fill position accomplishing 8-minute fill cycle, 100% station uptime, or some other metric?
Yes, so this would be like an idealized situation, right? This is assuming that stations aren't down because they can't get hydrogen. This is assuming that the station can do that the stations can meet their rated capacity. I will say though that short of equipment failures or whatever, these rated capacities are based on a vetted model that we use that was developed by the National Renewable Energy Laboratory. It's called HyScape, the Hydrogen Station Capacity Estimator tool. And so these capacities already taken into account things like the typical fueling pattern throughout a day. And it takes into account the equipment performance specifications. So short of the equipment not being able to actually perform as specified, or very often malfunction, then these capacities should be fairly accurate for what the station does. And I think we've really seen this come through some of the station dispensing data as well, when we see how much hydrogen can actually go through a single dispenser each day from this data. So somewhat idealized, I mean, for sure idealized in terms of like, yeah, there's no downtime assumed here, but it's all based on those rated capacities.
Great. Here's one back to the renewable content. With most of the hydrogen coming from SMR today, how are the station owners achieving that renewable content that you presented?
Right, so the renewable content is a mix of, there is some renewable biogas that goes through SMR. There is some accounting for renewable energy credits. That's kind of fungible. That's assumed throughout all of California's renewable accounting, no matter what energy use you're talking about. There is some direct renewable from solar. It's a variety of things. I don't believe, I would have to check, I don't believe that even though there is some byproduct hydrogen, but I don't think that counts as renewable by our definitions. But essentially anything that meets the definitions that are set out in the Public Utilities and Public Resources Code counts. And that includes things like solar, wind, it includes hydro, it includes biogases, and all of those resources are the same resources that count if you were going to generate electricity, renewable electricity, right? So it's all a consistent definition across the state.
Good. A question here about the cost assumptions for the advanced clean fleets assumes hydrogen infrastructure will be publicly available. Is that a reasonable consideration considering the long lead times and development we're doing now?
Yeah, I'm not an expert on advanced clean fleets. And so I
know you don't speak for the entire state, so I will put that caveat out there for you.
Yeah, I'm not, so I mean, I assume it will depend on what part of the fleet you're talking about. If you're talking about light duty vehicles or even possibly medium duty vehicles, and whether or not they can actually utilize the same nozzles and get the same, and are expecting the same flow rates and the same fueling protocol, and are built for all of that to be using these same stations, then yes, it could potentially help with the infrastructure. What I personally have not looked at is capacity for that, or whether or not those locations that are good for light duty infrastructure to support getting light duty customers are the same locations you would want to build for these medium duty or these other commercial vehicle applications. I will note that GFO 19602 actually does encourage station developers to consider ways to be able to fuel commercial vehicles as well, and that could be commercial light duty or commercial medium heavy duty, as long as it does not impede with the light duty fueling capability. So the stations really are built for light duty, but if they can also accommodate the other, that was actually taken into consideration in the scoring and the awarding of the funds. And I do think like 16 stations plan on having some kind of commercial fueling.
Right, that's where I was actually going to go. Not a question anyone provided, but we see now the heavy duty market starting to come alive. And I know you don't have through AB8 or any direct, I'll say, task on the heavy duty side that's similarly, but just curious from all the great work you've done here over the years on AB8, have you thought about how you might even propose within CARB and the state? How do we look at really tracking and advancing the heavy duty side, both from these lessons and then because, as you point out, some of these stations will be the same stations?
Yeah, so that's a
pretty wide thing, Andrew. You know, I'm going to give you a few fun ones here.
Yeah, it's a big question, and it's a question. I mean, to be honest, it's a question we've been asking ourselves for a while. How do we translate some of this to the medium and heavy duty case? You know, there are differences in how you want to build the network, right? I think the partnership's truck vision document highlights some of that, right? For building a light duty station network, you want it close to people's homes so that they realize, like, yeah, I can adopt this vehicle and go through my daily routes. But every individual is an individual, and they have all these different paths that they go on, and so you're trying to capture traffic as it passes. It's not quite the same with commercial vehicles. Commercial vehicles, you pretty much know at least for a lot of it what their route is. There's major routes for freight, for example, and so your planning and like your fundamentals of how you build the network are going to be different. So you know, in some sense, there's some of the same tools might have analogs, but they would probably be different for planning in medium and heavy duty and other commercial applications. I will note that today on National Hydrogen Day, Governor Newsom signed SB Senate Bill 643, which I think Energy Commission is a lead, but also consults with CARB and I think the Public Utilities Commission on doing an analysis of the needs of infrastructure, hydrogen production, et cetera, for basically every transportation application other than light duty, everything that is not yet addressed. So it was just signed today, as I understand, and so that's something to look out for, and how what those reports will show and how those analysis methodologies will be developed. Yeah, I don't know that I'll be part of it, but we'll see.
Well, I think you had the right answer that we're asking those questions internally. I mean, this I didn't want to let it go that you've done good work here. Let's see what might apply. Let's ask the hard questions and move forward. So thanks for letting me put you on that little bit of a hot seat. Here's one that might be an easy one. What triggers the beginning of reporting a station in development in your report? Is it something like applying to the municipality, application for HRI? How are you? Because I know how we have different ways to do it on our station map, but I think that's an interesting question for folks.
So we report on everything we know. So everything that's funded through a solicitation. So that is one way that we get information about stations. But also now that the LCFS program has that HRI provision, we actually had a number of stations that first came onto our radar because they applied to that. And they actually haven't gotten grant funding since then, even though they're being included as match funding from that applicant. In terms of these different statuses of the stations, we've been trying to streamline this over the years. We used to have different development phases, but that was starting to get a bit much, especially now that we have so many different stations that are planned for the future. So, to do this analysis, we really want to make sure we're understanding where every station development, every projected station development is happening. Like I said, we have a few stations that are fully privately funded now, but they came in through HRI, so we knew about them. I anticipate that probably that will be the way most, or if not all, privately funded stations will come into our knowledge. We'll get an application for HRI, and if it's approved, then we will start counting it in our analysis. And we need to make sure we account for those stations, because we're making recommendations for where new development needs to go, and we want to make sure that we're not undercounting or underestimating like the coverage or the capacity in certain areas of the state, and then making a misinformed recommendation on where there's still a gap, right, or how big the gaps are. So I think going forward, at least through the end of the AB8 program, it's going to be through what we learned through the GFO, and then what we learned through LCFS program. That's really going to drive what stations we report on.
Great. Well, I think we are at our time, and I want to thank you, Andrew. As always, this is stimulating, exciting, more questions than we could ever answer. So I thank you for this time, and I will look forward to the next time, and happy Hydrogen Day.